My name is Kei Ueda, curator of the Japanese Diaspora collection and a research fellow at the Hoover Institution. We are honored to have Professor Yoko Tsukuda, vice chairperson of the Japanese Association for Migration Studies, and Professor Toyotomi Morimoto from the International Committee as our distinguished discussants today. Our public speaker, Professor Koikari, will serve as a discussant for session 3 tomorrow. Before we begin, I'd like to extend my sincere gratitude to our director, Condoleezza Rice, the Board of Overseers, and all of our supporters. A special thanks to Professor Emeritus John Stefan, whose endowment has been pivotal in sustaining the Japanese Diaspora Initiative. The workshop will feature 9 young scholars presenting their papers over 3 90-minute sessions, each consisting of 3 presentations. At the end of each session, our discussants will provide their comments, followed by Q&As. We'll have 2 sessions today and 1 tomorrow afternoon, with discussions and concluding remarks by Professor Eiichiro Azuma. And please use the same webinar link to join us for both days of this exciting workshop. Before we begin session 1, I'd like to share some updates of our archival collections. Our collaboration with institutions in Okinawa, such as Mayo University, Yuki University, and the Okinawa Prefectural Library, is yielding exciting results. Soon, we'll be adding missing issues of Jitsugyo no Hawaii and Yamato Shimbun, which were published in pre-war Hawaii, to our collection. Additionally, journals related to the Okinawa Relief Committee or Okinawa Kyusai Inkai, documenting post-war relief efforts led by the Okinawan communities in Brazil and Hawaii, will be soon accessible in the Hojo Shimbun digital collection. Unfortunately, last major Japanese language newspaper in Hawaii ceased to publish at the end of last year. However, we are working closely with Hawaii Hochi to preserve its legacy. We'll be adding post-war issues of Hawaii Hochi to our digital collection, with plans to make both pre-war and post-war issues available to the public by the end of this year. Brazil was a major destination for Japanese immigrants for decades, and it also attracted significant interest from Japanese businesses. A notable example is Tozan Nojo or Fazenda Monteste, a coffee farm owned and operated by the Iwasaki family of Mitsubishi. This farm stands as a testament to the rich history of coffee production by the Nikkei community in Brazil, will soon make its plantation journal available in the Hojo Shimbun digital collection as well. We are also bringing more Japanese diaspora-related archival materials to our reading room. For instance, the Iwao Shimizu is featured here at Tule Lake Segregation Center, provide a vivid depiction of the journalist experience at the Tule Lake Segregation Center during World War II. His son Hiroshi featured here as a young boy, and I have translated his diary and interviews into English. Additionally, many Japanese Americans were involved in the occupation of Japan after World War II, and we have recently received donations from Japanese American families that capture their experiences during this period. We hope you visit our reading room to hear their voices firsthand. Now, let me introduce Professor Yoko Tsukuda as the discussant of session 1.
Hello, thank you for my introduction of Dr. Kei Ueda. I'm Yoko Tsukuda, an associate professor at Seiju University, Tokyo, Japan. I will serve as a moderator and a discussant for session 1, Economic Networks and Japanese Diaspora. So it is my great honor to be part of the Japanese Diaspora workshop again. As vice president of the Japanese Association for Migration Studies, Nihon Imin Gakkai JAMS, I express my sincere gratitude to Hoover Institution for co-hosting this workshop with JAMS and generously providing such a great venue with great accommodations. Many thanks go to Dr. Kei Ueda and all of those who have worked hard to make this incredible opportunity possible. And of course, without many applicants, this workshop wouldn't have happened. So I thank all the applicants for this year's workshop, including the presenters here. And I hope this workshop will become a wonderful opportunity to build academic networks of scholars who share interests in Japanese diaspora. So let me introduce three presenters of session one. The first presenter is Issay Matsumoto. Issay is a doctoral candidate in the history department at the University of Southern California, where he is completing a dissertation that examines the relationship between the rise of tourism in Hawaii and the state's growing connections with Asia and the Pacific after World War II. And the second presenter is Maria Cynthia Barriga. Dr. Barriga is an assistant professor at Hitotsubashi University. Her research interest is the changing dynamics of Japanese and non-Japanese locals in the Philippines and Guam during World War II. And the third presenter is Yuki Hoshino. Yuki is a PhD candidate in history at Stanford University. He's currently working on his dissertation, Global Imperial City, Osaka, 1920 to 50. So each presentation is 20 minutes. And after three presentations, I will make some comments with some questions, and then open discussions to the floor and online audience. So, Issay, so please start your presentation.
Thank you very much to Dr. Kei Ueda and Hiromi Okazawa for all your labor putting this together. Yeah, and also all the members of Imin Gakkai for your work on this, especially Professor Tsukura for being a discussant today. Okay, I'll get started. Exclusion from land and home ownership holds a central place within early 20th century Asian American historiography. Yet many exclusion-era contemporaries turned to Hawaii, where ownership was not systematically restricted, as a site for US-Japan cooperation through its geographic position and exceptional economic opportunities. In 1919, Hawaii-based white American lawyer Carl Smith expressed his disapproval of the 1913 California Alien Land Law and hailed Hawaii as the, quote, meeting point between America and Japan, end quote, where the Japanese community in Hawaii could promote goodwill between the two countries. In 1921, Japanese industrialist Shibusawa Eiichi described Hawaii as a, quote, experiment station, end quote, that would start a new chapter in US-Japan international friendship. In the landmark 1922 naturalization case, Takao Ozawa versus United States, Hawaii immigrant and Supreme Court plaintiff Takao Ozawa himself argued that while Japanese immigrants, quote unquote, earth hunger and, quote, wish to make a home, end quote, were the primary target of anti-Japanese racists in California, prejudice was, quote, innocuous in Hawaii, end quote. Existing scholarship has confirmed these depictions of the local Japanese community in Hawaii, establishing Asian exclusion in California as a key foil for crafting Hawaii as an assimilationist staging ground and shining example of pluralism, especially for later post-World War II discourses of interracial harmony. This scholarship has described 1920s and 1930s Hawaii as one of exceptional Japanese-American socioeconomic mobility and settlement. Other scholars have theorized local Japanese-American economic power in Hawaii as complicity to Asian or Japanese settler colonialism. Despite the critical need to study settler colonial power as a social phenomenon that involves participation from everyday people, scholarship on Japanese Americans in Hawaii has not examined the process by which the broader community of Japanese migrants became settlers and the process by which indigenous places became Japanese American spaces. As a foundational site for Asian American immigration history that seemingly undermines the rule of Asian American exclusion, Hawaii's settler colonial context begs the questions: how, why, and to what end did the broader local Japanese community pursue land and home ownership in Hawaii? For a migrant community that remitted their earnings to Japan, becoming a community of settlers was no simple task. I argue that the 1920s and 1930s constituted the key period during which growing numbers of Japanese migrants became settlers in Hawaii through the assistance of Japanese elites and liberal internationalist white Americans, who created ethnic and interracial firms tied to Japanese finance capital. My presentation will show how two unprecedented initiatives operating during this critical period, the International Trust Company and the American Japanese Investment Company, sought to establish spaces for what I term Japanese American settler belonging, entrenching ethnic segregation while setting the stage for the community's later post-war economic advancement. I use this term, settler belonging, as a way to denote the spatial logic and place-based understandings that undergirded Japanese American community and family formation and futurity in the settler colonial context of Hawaii. During this understudied period, Japanese real estate holdings in Hawaii grew from virtually zero, as you can see here, to $92.31 in 1930. Although Japanese real estate wealth remained the lowest in comparison to other ethnic groups, it increased disproportionately in the decades. In less than 2 decades, the value of Japanese-owned real estate grew by 35 times, outpacing every other ethnic and racial group, including whites. Settler belonging in Hawaii did not neatly fit into an assimilation paradigm that would privilege belonging to whiteness or attaining US citizenship, nor did it constitute a distinctly Asian or Japanese mode of settler colonialism. Rather, this form of belonging bound to Hawaii's local context reveals how the confluence of transnational migrant capital and the interracial business networks helped the local Japanese community develop a qualitatively different way of relating to their place of residence than they had as tenants and plantation laborers. Rising land and home ownership within the broader community during this period distinguished the financial practices of this migrant community, which once remitted its earnings to Japan, from its increasing tendency to invest its limited assets in settler colonial Hawaii. These new financial practices, developed relatively late, made the local Japanese a community of settlers, establishing ethnically bounded geographic settlements. The place-based forms of belonging based on land and home ownership that emerged in the 1920s demonstrates that scholars should not take for granted immigrants' status as settlers, but instead take what Kristen Sasaki calls an island-centered perspective and trace the historic conditions that allow and compel migrants from diverse origins to participate in settler colonial projects in the Pacific. So first, I'll discuss the American Japanese Investment Company. The first organized effort to secure a Japanese-American future in Hawaii through capital accumulation was led by Hiroshima-born Issay immigrant named George Shunichi Ikeda, who organized the American Japanese Investment Company in 1917. A self-starter, Ikeda first arrived in the islands in 1902 and created Honolulu's first taxicab company, employing himself as a driver in the 1910s before incorporating the AJIC in 1917. This firm was, the AJIC was initially capitalized at $25,000, which was quickly increased to $50,000. This was not an inconsiderable amount, totaling about 1/10 of Japanese savings in local banks in 1916. The other capitalists who established the AJIC with Ikeda were also Japanese, including one F. Komatsu and Ikeda's Hawaii-born sister, Shizuo. The source of this initial capital, however, is not known. Within the context of economic exclusion, Japanese immigrants like Ikeda pursued economic advancement by building firms dealing in real estate and providing accessible financial services catered specifically to Japanese immigrants. Despite the inequality between working-class Japanese immigrants and other ethnic groups in Hawaii, the AJIC quickly expanded, using the local press to cultivate a public image of social mobility and splendor for the Japanese community. Uncertainty about the future of the community, however, lay beneath the surface of this image in the context of exclusion. The AJIC solicited properties from mainstream English readers of the Honolulu Advertiser to develop and sell to local Japanese clients. In 1917, the firm wrote, quote, "The Japanese people here want homes or home sites. They, as our clients, are anxious to invest their money in Hawaii," end quote. By 1920, the AJIC announced that their assets had doubled to over $100,000, the majority of which was held through real estate for its anxious clientele. By 1924, Ikeda accumulated enough capital and connections to establish a trans-Pacific subsidiary between US mainland companies, Hawaii merchants, and a newly established Japan office to sell building materials in Japan. And by 1930, the firm even expanded beyond Oahu to open a Hilo branch. Although marginal in comparison to large white American corporate land holdings, the AJIC's efforts allayed growing unease about Japanese economic status within the local community and attracted editorial attention from the immigrant press. In 1926, community leader and newspaperman Soga Yasutaro, celebrated this quote-unquote pioneering firm. According to Soga, these efforts would help raise the quote-unquote weak local Japanese economic foundation as a community of laborers with what he called a quote emigrant's frame of mind, end quote, sending remittances home without local savings or assets. Although the Japanese population had recently attained a plurality in Hawaii, they still trailed behind the economic security of the Chinese and Portuguese communities. For Soga, land ownership would, quote, raise the position of the Japanese community in Hawaii and raise the confidence in them by people of other nationalities, end quote. Soga's celebration of the AJIC complemented the firm's trailblazing ventures in sites where Japanese American ownership were once unheard of. The AJIC developed 2 joint subdivisions in the Wahiawa Plantation District, which were obtained from a quintessential white American settler colonizer. The newly created developments were once part of the 600 acres of pineapple plantation owned by the early Wahiawa planter, William P. Thomas, a California-based settler and close friend of fellow Wahiawa resident, Pineapple King James Dole of the Dole Fruit Company. Following Thomas's death in 1916, the home was acquired by the AJIC and the tracts were renamed distinctly Japanese names, the Hakone and Yamato tracts. The visionaries for this Japanese settlement were Japanese immigrant elites with trans-Pacific ties to Japan, including the likes of merchants like Sekiya Kichitaro, Matsui Totaro of the Pacific Bank, Yamamoto Seizo, Motoshige and Company, which I think Professor Koikari mentioned earlier, and one prominent white American realtor named E.O. Farm. Sumida Daiso of the International Trust Company, which I'll discuss later, also invested capital. Although existing scholarship has described anti-Japanese racism in Hawaii pineapple plantation districts during the early 20th century, these ventures suggest that by the 1920s, Japanese immigrants and Japanese Americans had made substantial leeway in breaking down formal and informal land restrictions. The Wahiawa development galvanized the broader Japanese community across Oahu. The immigrant press lauded the settlement for not only pioneering a space for the Japanese community, but also its exceptional hand in developing Wahiawa into a new modern capital of the Oahu countryside by the 1930s, as most local land then was reserved for the US military and pineapple agribusiness. While the Yamato tract was developed for Japanese interested in larger scale agriculture, the Hakone tract was a upscale option designed for residences and small farms. According to the immigrant press, Wahiawa agricultural lands were ideal for vegetables, mushroom cultivation, flower gardens, poultry, pig farming, and the like, because the soil was fertile, the water was available and cheap. The modern homes of the settlement were featured prominently in the immigrant press as well and described as culture homes or bunka jutaku. And here you can see they're so cultured and they all look the same. Moreover, why is this not updating? Oh, it did. Moreover, Hakone tract residents had access to the pineapple planter William Thomas's old home, which the AJIC retrofitted into a clubhouse with chess and checker rooms, parlors, dining rooms, lanai, guest chambers, and Japanese bathrooms. The 1910 census indicates that the Thomas family once lived in the clubhouse with a Japanese servant and at least 7 Chinese and 4 Japanese laborers employed by the Thomas plantation. By the 1920s, however, the AJIC had gone to tremendous lengths to cater toward Japanese families and publicize their real estate investment opportunities through transforming the Thomas family home into a clubhouse that became the, quote, last word in rural social centers, end quote. And this became the centerpiece of their Wahiawa developments. In 1927, the AJIC provided free transportation to between 800 and 1,000 Japanese from across Honolulu and Oahu's plantation districts for the grand opening celebration of the Hakone and Yamato tracts. Those who joined were led on a tour of the 27-acre development and facilities by AJIC employees and provided with Japanese dramatic storytelling, puppeteering, music, picnicking, and other free festivities, converting what was once a domestic space for white American social reproduction and Japanese servitude into a site of splendor, rest, and recreation for working and middle-class Japanese immigrant families. The AJIC combated the community's significant economic challenges and established Wahiawa as a space for a community life. This, however, was not simply an assimilatory creation. Through the cultivation of a Japanese-American cultural space, supported by material investment in modern settler homes and infrastructure, the AJIC crafted a space for Japanese-American settler belonging out of the partial remains of the white American pineapple power structure. And next, I'll talk about the International Trust Company. Established shortly after the AJIC, the International Trust Company was incorporated in 1922 with $200,000 in seed capital, owned jointly by several white American and Japanese transnational capitalists, with much fanfare around its interracial leadership. This effort to join white American, Japanese, and even Chinese businessmen through the International Trust Company and its many subsidiaries was reportedly led by Wade Warren Thayer, the former Attorney General and Territorial Secretary in Hawaii. Thayer was joined by other white American liberal elites and professionals with sympathetic views toward the Japanese community, some of whom were members of the Institute for Pacific Relations and executives on the boards of the major Big Five sugar conglomerates like Frank Cook Atherton, John Waterhouse, Richard Cook, and others. The most notable of the ITC's initial Japanese investors was the Osaka-based multimillionaire Sumitomo Tomohito Kichizaemon, head of the Sumitomo Zaibatsu, who established the Sumitomo Bank of Hawaii. The local press in Hawaii at the time compared Sumitomo's prestige in Japan to the names of Rockefeller and Vanderbilt in the US. The local Japanese immigrant founders included Nakayama Goro, a US-educated Issay who served as vice president of Sumitomo Bank of Hawaii. The brothers Tajiro and Daizo Sumida of T. Sumida and Company had also invested capital as primary shareholders. And Sumida and his older brother Tajiro were self-funded Issei immigrants to Hawaii who established a trans-Pacific trading company with branches in Osaka, Tokyo, Kobe, and agricultural subsidiaries in Taiwan and Saipan. And his life is pretty heavily documented in Professor Azuma's work as well. Featuring such prominent investors, the ITC was considered the most high-profile joint US-Japanese business initiatives in Hawaii and the US, serving as a, quote, medium of common contact between these two races in Hawaii. And it was through this nexus of white American and transnational Japanese capitalists that in 1926, one 27-year-old Nisei real estate agent named Toshio Kondo created a new subdivision in the working class suburb of Moiliili at the rural outskirts of Honolulu, which he named the Kondo Tract after himself. Kondo was himself a longtime resident of the nearby Macaulay Tract before establishing the Kondo Tract on behalf of the International Trust Company. With the trust company's capital, Kondo purchased one parcel from a local German businessman and another from the Bishop estate for a total of $33,855.06. The parcels were combined, then subdivided into 44 plots to be sold as the Kondo Tract to a mostly Japanese working class clientele. Kondo claimed 6 of them for his young family, his wife Kikue and their newborn daughter, Yaiko. The rest were quickly bought up. Half-page Japanese language advertisements in the ethnic press, such as this one, claimed that the sites were ideal for Japanese people, particularly families who prized convenience and proximity to both the local Japanese language school and American public school. Conveyance records reveal that this new social space beyond the plantation was quite socioeconomically mobile. The first residents of the Kondo Tract comprised of a mix of skilled workers, not plantation hands. A sample of 32 of the first individuals to purchase plots, either in full or mortgaged, gives a sense of some of the occupations of these early Japanese settlers: retail merchant, truck driver, former laborer, and picture salesman, clerk, contractor, domestic worker, and carpenter. It also reveals about a half-and-half split between US and Japanese citizens. So here you can see a modest yet thriving intergenerational and mixed citizenship status community based on land ownership emerging in Moiliili. A full sample of the first residents who bought plots from the International Trust Company shows that, at least in the case of Kondo and the Kondo Tract, the international cooperation meant the production of an ethnically bounded and homogeneous community, in which more than 80% of homeowners were Japanese at a time when they constituted about 40% of the total Hawaii population. So to conclude, immigrant thrift alone does not explain the creation of Japanese American settler social spaces, worlds, and futures. Rather, exclusion-era interethnic networks and financial institutions such as the International Trust Company and the American Japanese Investment Company aided in this process, allowing the condos and other local Japanese from working-class backgrounds to establish thriving communities at a time when the Japanese was, quote, anxious to invest, end quote, their limited financial assets in Hawaii. The colorful accounts of the immigrant press, advertisements created by firms, and the bare numbers of census and conveyance records alone, however, do not give us a full picture of the spaces of belonging that were made by this confluence of white American and Japanese diasporic capital. So I want to leave you with this photograph, this family photograph that's been kept by the Sumida family, one of the first settler families of the Kondo Tract in 1926. Because photographs like this intimately embody how land and home ownership defined what belonging to a place as a racialized immigrant, barred from citizenship, meant in the settler colonial context of territorial Hawaii. During this period of uncertainty and strategic adaptation, I want to stress that land and home ownership not only provided wealth, but also created a stage for Japanese American belonging to a community, family, and future. Family photographs staged like the Sumida family posed on the Kondo Tract, where you can still see stakes marking the boundaries of plots for future settlement, capture a community and place in transition as the possession and settling of land made Japanese migrants become a Japanese American settler community. Thank you for listening, and I look forward to our discussion.
Okay. Hello, everyone. I'm Jaja or Maria, and the title of my presentation is Amid Successive Empires, the Japanese Question in Davao and Guam. I'm testing ideas for my book project, and what I'm going to do now is show you some of them. So thank you very much to Hoover Institution, Iningakai, and my fellow participants, and the tech support for giving us this opportunity. Right. Let's begin. I'll begin with the literature. Recently, Japanese studies have approached Japanese diaspora history from global history. For example, Azuma Sensei have shown that, and others have shown that Japanese settlers since the 19th century crossed the regional borders of Asia, Oceania, and the Americas, as well as the official boundaries of the US and the Japanese empires. The map, for example, is from Azuma Sensei's book, 2019, and it shows you the outward mobility of Japanese people outside Japan. And as they move out, they sustain diasporic networks of goods, people, ideas, and technology linking different points in the Asia Pacific. I follow this network or connectionist approach and consider myself, or try to be, a global historian. But rather than the flows, I focus on where the flows intersect. These intersections have been called contact zones, hybrid spaces of encounters, or beaches, or vortices, swirling whirlpools of social and cultural interactions. I mean the same thing, though I call them localities, and I focus on Davao and Guam. So where's Davao and Guam? If you look at the map, that's Western Pacific, you see Japan up, Philippines, and the Marianas. Davao is in southern Philippines, and Guam is in southern Marianas right there. Like many of the presenters here, I am interested in the overlap of the US and the Japanese empires. But coming from a post-colonial perspective, I am interested in places that experienced US and Japanese imperialism. And the Philippines and Guam are very good examples because both of them were under the US from the early 20th century until when Japan invaded and occupied the territories. And then during World War II, they were under Japan, meaning unlike Hawaii or California, they experienced actual Japanese military presence. And after Japan's defeat, they were again under the US. Despite this successive imperial experience, however, Davao and Guam are polar opposites of the same system. In Davao, Japanese companies owned more plantations than Filipinos and Americans combined, meaning they were economically present and controversial. Guam, however, the Japanese businesses are individual and family owned. Besides Japanese businesses in Davao, in terms of their ties with non-Japanese locals, in Davao, only 4% of the Japanese population were of Philippine Japanese parentage. Meanwhile, in Guam, an overwhelming 88% were born in the island. And as you will see later, they are of Japanese and Chamorro parentage. Right. Now, to wrap my mind around this Japanese diaspora in these post-colonial areas, I borrow the idea of Chinese question. I'm using Japanese question. Backtrack. Carolyn Howe wrote about the Japanese migration in the Philippines, but she uses the idea of Chinese question. In the Philippines, there's a really complicated history of Chinese migration, and there are a lot of terms employed to pertain to them. Chinese mestizo, Filipino Chinese, Chinoy, and every term has its own connotation and contingent on many factors. Examining the question unpacks aspects of identity, ethnicity, nation, and region. And that's what I do. I look at the Japanese question to unpack aspects of race, nation, and empire in and beyond Davao. I was mentioning that I'm working on a book project. The book project is centered into 3 questions. Amid successive empires and violent imperial transitions, first, how did Japanese locals mobilize their global connection? 2, how was, quote, quote, the Japanese racialized in relation to Filipino and Chamorro, the natives of Guam? And third, how has this racialized image been countered in the locality? In this presentation, I focus only on the first question, even though it's the second question that I utilized sources from Hoover Institution Hoji Shimbun collection, only because the first question seems more apt for the workshop. Right, so I'll begin with Guam. In 1937, in the local magazine, Guam Recorder, you see this photo published, and the photo is captioned, "A Picnic of Japanese Society of Guam." You see happy faces of people, some of them doing the banzai pose, and very clearly behind them, you have the Japanese flag and the American flag. They were, to, again, borrow Azuma Sensei's phrase, between 2 empires. But I won't focus so much on their in-betweenness of the 2 empires. I want to focus now on how they are connected to the island. As mentioned a while ago, 88% of the Japanese in Guam were born on the island. And if you look at the census manuscripts, Japanese locals intermarried with Chamorros. This is an example of a census manuscript. If you look at this part, it's the Okiyama family. If you look at the races that of the parents, Japanese and Chamorro. And if you look at the place of birth, everyone is on Guam except the dad. Right. Not only were they part of Japanese Chamorro family, they were also part of Chamorro society. This is another page. If you look at the Yamanaka household, you see Josefina. She's a teacher, and she appears quite often in the Guam Recorder. If you look at September 1938, she was recognized for her 4 years of service in the educational system in Guam. She was married to a Chamorro, and then later on, she was promoted again. She's in the local periodical. She was part of the Chamorro family. Now, given this inclusion in the Chamorro society, how did they use their Japanese and Chamorro connection during the imperial transition, during Japanese invasion? To answer this question, I look at the source, War Years on Guam, Narratives of the Chamorro Experience. It's an unpublished collective biography, safe kept in the Micronesian Area Research Center in the University of Guam. And it was gathered in the 1980s by students led by Kathleen Owings, who's a professor there. It includes 74 Guam locals about their experiences of Japan's attack on the island on December 1941, the US surrender 2 days later, and the Japanese military occupation, which lasted until 1944. Right. So it's local Chamorros' account of the war. First account by Maria Efe. Then on the last night, we were called again to the office of another officer, the Ataisho. They assigned each of us to one Japanese, but we argued saying that some of us had already been punished for that because we did not want to accept. A Japanese that was married to a Guamanian or Chamorro and had lived on Guam was our interpreter at that time. His name was Tanhosen Iwatsu. It was he that responded for us, otherwise we'd get some punishment for that. Another account says, I worked as a plumber, Ichang Shimizu and I. There were Ton Jose Flores and his son Enrique, Ton Jose Piling, Shintaro, and several others. The Japanese soldiers made us drink sake and they made us eat miso and fish. Yes, we did celebrate at times here in the plumbing group. I don't know about the other groups, but with Ton Ichang Shimizu as our leader, we did have parties here. What can we take from that? Japanese locals mediated between the Japanese military and the Chamorros, and the Chamorro remember that. And Chamorros addressed these Japanese locals as Ton or Tan. They were considered as Chamorro elders. Ton and Tan are like Obasang or Ojisang. And their connection to the Japanese military made them Chamorro leaders instead of collaborators. In other respects, they would be deemed as collaborators, a very negative connotation in places invaded and occupied by Japan. But here in the memories, they're leaders. Right, so returning to the Japanese question, during the imperial shift from the US to Japan, Guam's Japanese locals used their global connections to mediate between the Japanese military and their Chamorro communities. That's for Guam. Now moving on to Davao. See, this photo is very reminiscent to the other photo a while ago in Guam. It's in the Philippine-Japan Historical Museum in Davao City. And you see this is the Bayabas Japanese Elementary School. You have the kids. And again, you have the two flags, but the additional Philippine flag. Davao's Japanese locals were between Japan and the US-sponsored Philippines. In this presentation, though, what I want to highlight is the globality of the Japanese, of Davao. In my other project, we are indexing this thing called Matsui Film Collection. The Matsui family were based in Manila and they have businesses all over the Philippines, and they took family videos of their travels all over the country. And in one video, you have here a Japanese family in the plantation in Davao in the 1930s. And then the video continues, it shifts focus to a village near the plantation, and it focuses on Maragoshokai. It's a Japanese retail store in the nearby village. And then again, once you have that, it focuses on different aspects of the Japanese store and indigenous people converging in it. I know that some scholars would look at Japanese gaze objectifying indigenous people. But we can also look at this same source to see the globality of rural Davao. See, you have an indigenous person in front, but you have a 1930s American Ford Jitney in the background. And behind the Jitney, you have a Japanese store with Japanese merchandise and Japanese goods in Philippine Spanish-style architecture. Davao, even rural Davao in the 1930s, was global. So how did Davao's local Japanese use their connections during the imperial transition? To answer this, I look at the Pacific War Japanese residents in Davao, facts on the atrocity, shooting, looting, and arson by the local Philippine forces. This is a report, original in Japanese, all translations are mine, and it's part of a collection published in 1993 by the Dabokai, a post-war Japan-based association organized by Davao repatriates in the 1960s. It includes the reports, 1940 reports of the Davao Japanese Association district residents. And then So the different reports and summarized by the Davao Consul Haruki Mori to the Japanese military, dated February 1942, about their experience of internment at the outbreak of the war and their release by the invading Japanese military. So Haruki Mori summarized the report. 6 a.m. on December 8th, because the radio broadcast reported the Empire were in battle with the US and England in the Western Pacific, the executives of the Japanese Association convened. Besides ordering the execution of the self-defense plan, we paid a visit to the heads of the Philippine Military Police, the Davao Filipino City Mayor, and the Davao Filipino Governor Representative to request for an assurance that the authorities will do their utmost best to protect the lives of the Japanese nationals. They all consented. We informed the representatives of the Japanese nationals living in other provinces that the war has broken out. Upon our advice, they sought the nearest Philippine authorities and requested for the protection of the lives of the nationals. That's the consul. The district presidents also wrote the same thing. December 8th, this is in Kalinan. December 8th, from 8 a.m., the Philippine military took into custody the Japanese nationals they met along the way in the vicinity of Kalinan, as well as Gumalan in the Baguio area. They were boarded on a truck and entered into the Malagos barracks. As a result of the negotiation between him, section chief, and the chief of the Philippine military, we compromised that the nationals were to be interned in 7 places within the Kalinan area. The women and the children in the Kalinan Elementary School were also supposed to be moved to Davao, but upon another negotiation, all the women and the children in the school remained there. You have to understand that the Japanese district presidents, they want to keep their members in the neighborhood because they know the people there. Yet there was a central command from Davao City Central to move everyone in the City Central internment camps. They don't want that. Number one, it's far. It's no longer within their jurisdiction. Number two, the City Central camps were packed and ill-prepared. They want their people to remain within where they can safeguard them. In another district, Digos, at around 8 a.m. of December 8, following the district's plan, the Malalag Filipino authorities informed the Japanese Association district head that the Japanese attack began. Immediately, by the order of the district head, all members were instructed to seek refuge in the Japanese elementary school. However, around 10 a.m., 2 autobus came to the school. By the order of the headquarters, all Japanese nationals must be interned in Davao City Central. Following that, again, the district head and the Philippine troops negotiated. It was agreed that we will be encamped in the school and the Padada company with the troops as guard. Again, try to keep your people within your own jurisdiction. Finally, in the Wangan district, at 9 o'clock, the Philippine authorities came to begin moving the adults to the Malagos barracks for internment. We were to be forcefully loaded on a truck and then dispatched. But then, Philippine official Lieutenant Villares, together with Mr. Ikeda, arrived on a car from Kalinan and gave permission to intern all the Japanese nationals from Wangan to the Wangan Japanese Elementary School. Keep your people intact. Conclusion, if you look at that, how did Japanese locals mobilize their global connections during the violent imperial transition? Those in Guam mediated between the Japanese military and their Chamorro community. And those in Davao negotiated with the Philippine authorities to safeguard their Japanese community during the internment. They used their connections during the imperial transition. What's the implication of that finding? My study advances the scholarship on Japanese diaspora by raising the places that experienced successive imperial transitions. It highlights not only regional connections, but local bonds. Japanese local bonds to Filipinos, their local bonds to Chamorros. How local bonds were used, how they were severed, how they persisted, how they transformed during this period of violent imperial transition. Japanese and US imperialism divided the Marianas. Keith Camacho, who's a Chamorro from the Marianas, already showed that divergent colonial histories of islands in the Marianas caused a rift between Guam and the Northern Mariana Islands. And I see that also in the Philippines. And I think this impact of Japanese and US imperialism in the islands necessitate us to consider post-colonial histories. I agree with Camacho, yes, but I believe that the divide is not complete. As mentioned, local bonds persist. Then, during that time, during the war, and even now, the very fact that I'm making this presentation, the very fact that Camacho was able to write what he wrote, shows that local bonds persist, and thus we need to consider them local connections. Thank you very much, and I look forward to the comments.
Okay, can everyone hear me? Okay, great. Okay, I'm just gonna get started. Okay, so if I had to summarize the point of my paper in a single sentence, it is that migration to Brazil in the 1920s and 1930s was driven not by Tokyo, but by Osaka. In fact, it is difficult for me to imagine Japanese migration to Brazil at the scale of hundreds of thousands without the persistent and enthusiastic push by Osaka to send people that way. Osaka, I argue, made one of the largest Japanese immigration happen. To show you how, I am going to introduce you today three key historical figures with deep ties to Osaka. Through them, I hope to shed light on Osaka's local network that pushed for Japanese migration to Brazil. The three figures are Hirao Hachisaburo, Hazaki Shinji, and Murata Shozo. They are relatively famous figures, and by no means do they lack like biographies and bronze statues. However, they are known more prominently for acts other than migration. And one way to reframe the contribution of this paper is in connecting these locally and nationally prominent figures to the history of Japanese migration through the common thread of an Osaka-based network. So here's the plan for my paper. I have a couple of disclaimers to go over, and then I will discuss the three figures independently first, with a bit more emphasis on the third figure, Murata and OSK, and then I'll discuss their activities as a group. So first thing first, I have to give two important disclaimers. First, in this paper, I use the geographical unit of Osaka more liberally than most general or academic uses. In particular, when using the term Osaka, I actually include the city of Kobe. The municipalities of Osaka City and Kobe City were certainly distinct and separate, but the economic, social, and political activities of those who resided in the two cities crisscrossed with one another on an everyday basis. The history that I uncovered really demands that I treat the two cities as one larger unit because the network of powerful individuals who drove migration worked across both Osaka and Kobe. That is why, for the purposes of my paper, I include Kobe when I say Osaka. The second disclaimer I must put out is about what I mean by the city of Osaka when I say Osaka pushed for migration. Defining a city is notoriously difficult, but what I mean here is quite simple. It is the network of powerful individuals whose interests aligned with the overall economy of Osaka. Therefore, this does not suggest that these people were born or raised in Osaka. In fact, most of the people who were in this group were born outside of Osaka, including the three individuals I discussed today. It was largely a coincidence that individuals like Hirao, Tazaki, and Murata ended up in Osaka-based institutions at the beginning of their professional careers. However, the informal alliance that they later formed in Osaka was highly intentional and deliberate. They were not Osaka native, but they certainly aligned their own professional fortunes with that of Osaka by being central members of the Osaka business and high social circles, including OSK and Osaka Club. Okay, so now that the disclaimers are done, let's move into a discussion of the three figures. So individually, they each played a distinct but central role in the migration projects. Put simply, Hirao organized, Tazaki trained, and Murata shipped. So first, Hirao is most widely known for establishing Konan University and school system in the upper class suburbs of Kobe. He started this charity work in 1910 and successively expanded the school system in the 1920s. Hirao's occupation, however, was running the Osaka and Kobe branches of Tokyo Marine Insurance Company. He began working there in 1894 and eventually became a member of the board. He seems to have had an ongoing interest in migration since these early years, but it was really in 1924 that he took a trip to Brazil. From then on, migration projects to Brazil became a serious lifelong commitment. In 1925, upon returning to Japan, he quit Tokyo Marine. A year later, in 1926, he worked with officials at the Kobe City and Hyogo prefectural offices to establish Japan-Brazil Association, the first of its kind in the country. Their first task, as some of you may know, was to establish the Kobe Immigration Center, completed 2 years later in 1928. This center single-handedly managed the paperwork, medical screenings, and educational training of about 1,000 migrants at once. Hirao and the association continued to work assiduously to promote migration, holding public talks and establishing co-ops for migrants in the early 1930s. In making all of this happen, the national government certainly provided the majority of the funding, but Kobe City provided the land, and the prefecture funded 1/3 of the project and even designed the building. These migration promotion projects were more Osaka-based than anything else, with Hirao organizing at the center of Japan-Brazil Association. So the second figure, Tazaki Shinji, on the other hand, was engaged in training the younger generation of leaders for migratory missions to South America. In 1908, he began working at Kobe Higher Commercial School as a professor, and his first batch of students graduated in the early 1910s. They in turn became presidents and directors of key organizations for Japanese migration to Brazil. In the 1920s, a second batch of students graduated, supplying workforce for Japanese institutions in Brazil. When his school was promoted to a university status in 1929, Tazaki simultaneously had developed plans to create a colonial studies department at his university. But when his plan fell through, he instead resorted to endorsing one of his former students create the Higher Colonial School in Tokyo under Kokushikan University. The school in the 1930s eventually produced 7 classes of trainees who migrated to Brazil. So Tazaki, directly and indirectly, trained the key personnel that supported Japanese efforts in Brazil. And finally, Murata shows us impact on the global circuitry of goods and people out of Japan to South America cannot be overstated. Murata began working at the Osaka Shosen Kabushiki Kaisha, better known as OSK, in 1900. He spent most of his career running and building new lines to far-flung places, first in Shanghai and then in Europe, Africa, and the Americas. In 1914, he was promoted to the foreign lines manager at the very moment that OSK was experiencing a rapid expansion of its services beyond East Asia. Murata was at the forefront of this maritime expansion, especially in the development of Europe and South America lines. One result, as well as the cause of this expansion, was the rise of Osaka as a center of global capitalism. Osaka Bay Area, inclusive of Kobe, carried more than 60% of all foreign trade from mainland Japan, with Yokohama trading at merely 26% during the first half of the 1930s. While Yokohama, in dark blue on the right, dominated trade with North America. Osaka Bay Area, in orange and green, accounted for more than 70% of trade with Asia, Africa, and Central and South Americas. Passenger business was similarly skewed toward Osaka Bay Area, which handled over half of all foreign departures and arrivals throughout the 1930s. Yokohama, on the other hand, handled less than 10%. In particular, Kobe was by far the single most important port for foreign travel in the 1930s, facilitating movement of people in and out of the empire. Of course, Murata and Osuke certainly did not single-handedly develop Osaka into this global metropolis, but they were undoubtedly a part of the story. At its peak in 1936, OSK transported a grand total of about 1.5 million people and 10 million tons of cargo, which compared to about half of the 3 million passengers and a quarter of 45 million tons of cargo that Osaka and Kobe together handled that year. The relatively large number of passengers was also reflected in OSK's business model, which consistently carried more than 8 to 10 times the number of passengers at its main rival NYK, based in Yokohama. So building this maritime empire, however, took tremendous capital and time. It took years to build the infrastructure and know-hows for the smooth running of the 1,000-ton machineries on each route. Especially in creating a completely new line where no Japanese ships had sailed before, the task ranged from finding the right storage spacing and anchoring points to securing port laborers and customers for the myriad goods that could potentially be shipped economically. Shipping people, in particular, was a complex task that required taking into account the different immigration policies, racial relations, and navigational safety. So this, the cholera outbreak on Hawaii Maru in 1928, for example, shows the logistical complexity of shipping 1,000 or so people to a destination 18,000 kilometers away. The outbreak happened a few hours after departing Singapore and left OSK and foreign ministry officials scrambling to contain the incident. The fear, especially coming from the Japanese ambassador to Brazil, was that it could lead to a total ban on Japanese migration. The incident eventually resolved after taking the lives of 17 people and stopping the ship for 30 days for quarantine, sanitation, and treatment. While the surviving 700 or so passengers were eventually allowed to enter Brazil on June 13th, the incident also served as a wake-up call for OSK, which should begin assuming more and more responsibilities for smooth migration. By 1930, OSK was sending detailed medical reports on each journey to the foreign ministry with details on the different ailments passengers experienced during the 40-day trip. It was also vamping up its disciplinary structure for the migrant passengers, including household-based policing, schooling for children, and exercise programs on these ships. To borrow the words of Negawa Sachio, who has written on the migrants' experience of these voyages, OSK was assuming the responsibility of transforming ordinary people into colonists and citizens of the, quote, first-class nation. Financially as well, OSK had to figure out a way to make the South America line profitable. According to more celebratory accounts of Murata, he was responsible for putting the South America line above the profit margin, which he accomplished by innovatively extending the line to North America and making it into a round-the-world line through the Panama Canal. Income from transporting goods from South America to North America allegedly made the line profitable for the first time. Financial reporting by OSK, in fact, shows that the line made profit only 6 out of 15 years of pre-war operation. It was only by combining the income from national subsidy, migrant income, and cargo fares across different regions that the line became potentially profitable. However, as Yagashiro Hideyoshi points out, even then, it was far inferior in investment than other lines that OSK operated. What this indicates, I would add, is that without a financially comfortable company like OSK, and perhaps without Murata, migration to Brazil would most certainly have been much more expensive, if not prohibitively so. In other words, Murata and Osuke's decision to invest and keep investing resources into South America line was absolutely central to the making of Japanese migration to Brazil. Okay. So far, we have looked at Freeman's efforts for migration projects independently. However, records also indicate that it was a deeply collaborative effort that involved exchange of ideas and cooperation. Documented connections amongst the three surfaced in the 1920s. By 1922, Hirao and Murata were working together to establish the Osaka Rotary Club, and were also members of the highly exclusive Osaka Club. In 1924, Hirao felt close enough to Murata that he wrote from Brazil a rather blunt letter to Murata, urging OSK to assume more direct responsibilities for migration projects. The letter even asked OSK to build a migration preparation center in Kobe, an idea that materialized not as an OSK facility, but as a public one that was established by the Japan-Brazil Association discussed earlier. It is also telling, I think, that Murata's subordinate at OSK was one of Japan-Brazil Association's founding board members. Tazaki, on the other hand, was teaching already by 1912, the first recipient of Hirao's privately funded scholarship program. Furthermore, Tazaki's South America Research Group at Kobe Higher Commercial School invited Hirao and even Murata to give talks to his students on South America and migration, inspiring a number of promising young people to join the business. The culmination of the Osakan Alliance came in 1935. That prior year, in 1934, Brazil had passed legislation imposing strict immigration quotas. Immediately, a special task force was organized by Japan-Brazil Association to discuss countermeasures for this restriction. Tazaki served as the leader of the task force, with Hirao and Murata participating as well. The task force eventually put together a plan to dispatch an economic mission to Brazil, with the hope that further economic cooperation could lead to a loosening of the restrictions for Japanese migrants. In April 1935, 8 delegates left Japan and headed for Brazil. This time, Hirao served as the leader, and 5 companies sent representatives. So OSK, Toyo Boseki, Hitotsu Shoji, Mitsui Bussan, and Mitsubishi Shoji. They were then joined by an official from the Foreign Ministry and a medical professor at the University of Osaka. Thus, of these 8, 4 represented institutions based in Osaka, while the Tokyo-based institution Mitsubishi was actually sending the vice manager of their Osaka branch. In other words, Japan's most dynamic response to Brazil's restrictive immigration law came not from Tokyo, but from Osaka, specifically from the Osaka network, of which Hirao, Tazaki, and Murata were central members. The economic mission yielded no tangible results in terms of migration policy changes, but it prompted a stunning 7-fold increase in the export of cotton from Brazil to Japan in 1936. Japan, or more precisely, Osaka, became the largest destination for Brazilian cotton. From OSK's point of view, this mission had in effect successfully substituted migration with cotton trade, offsetting losses in passenger revenue with increased cotton cargo revenue. Such a turn of events from settlers to cotton is perhaps one consequence of Osaka's dominance over Brazilian relations. No other city would have been so eager to trade cotton without the textile industries like Osaka's. So I want to conclude with 2 points. The first is that while this paper focused on Brazil, there are indications that Osaka's reach went far beyond just one migration destination. OSK boasted an overwhelming share of shipping lines to Okinawa and Taiwan, and dominance over lines to South China and Manchuria. In fact, East Asia ushered in over 5 times passenger income as that of South America, and especially in terms of profit, lines in East Asia were magnitudes more profitable than Brazil lines. A substantial amount of these passenger stylus were migrant settlers to Manchuria and Taiwan. And it was not just OSK that aggressively expanded its global reach. The city and prefecture of Osaka had their own representatives in over 40 different locations around the world in the 1930s and 30s. It was again the Osakan Alliance that sought expansion and yielded influence over the historical and geographical trajectories of Japanese migration. The particular social, economic, and political dynamics of Osaka's connections to places such as Okinawa, Taiwan, and Manchuria remain a topic for future research. The second and my final point for today is the exploitative nature of the relationship between the Osaka network and the migrants. Some members of the Osaka network visited Brazil, including Hirao and Tazaki. as well as the later president of OSK in the post-war period. Their visits were ostensibly for supporting the colonists, and they were greeted as esteemed guests of honor in Brazil. It is indeed actually impressive that the president of Kobe University, what would later become Kobe University, the board member of Tokyo Marine, and the president of OSK took at least 3 months of their time to sit on a steamship to visit these places. Yet, as numerous studies have shown, virtually all migrant settlers were disillusioned by the reality of making a living in one of the harshest living environments on Earth. Many died, many escaped, and many went back to Japan. When Tazaki visited Brazil in 1936, one of the colonists came up to Tazaki and pleaded him to let him leave. The desperate colonists explained that the Amazons was not a place for human habitation and that they were misled and deceived into migrating there. Tazaki's response was flatly that he did not know anything, could not do anything, and that they needed to talk to someone else. Osaka, including Tazaki, had painted a very rosy picture of life in Brazil as they promoted migration. In turn, Osaka-based companies like OSK reaped profit from the migration business. When migrants confronted them about their deception, however, it was all too easy for Osaka to simply dismiss them and to forget them. Thank you.
Thank you, Yuki, and thank you for all the presenters. So, okay, so I'm going to begin my comments. So I briefly summarize each paper. So one of the purposes of this workshop is to discuss Japanese diaspora from global perspective. So all 3 papers focus on different Japanese diasporic communities. Matsumoto's paper on Hawaii and Barriga's comparative study focuses on Davao and Guam, and Hoshino's paper focuses on OSK's involvement in Japanese immigration to Brazil. And since I myself specialize in post-war Japanese American communities in the US mainland, especially California, so let me excuse myself that I'm not a specialist on each presenter's topics. But as I recently started researching Yokohama Specie Bank in pre-war Japanese American communities, so economic networks between different races, localities, and nations discussed in 3 papers are very stimulating to me. Thank you. So I will discuss some reflections and their papers in the orders of presentations and my comments and questions. Let me begin with Matsumoto's paper. So his paper provides a different way of understanding the land ownership of Japanese Americans in Hawaii and Hawaii's territorial period. He focuses on homes rather than farms. Hawaii's modest attitudes toward Japanese landowners were in stark contrast with the adoption of restrictive alien land laws in the US mainland. Despite this, or because of this, the land ownership by Japanese Americans in Hawaii is now being studied well now. Also, given the post-war socioeconomic mobility of Japanese Americans in Hawaii, Japanese have been regarded as victimizers of settler colonialism against Native Hawaiians recently. But Issay argues that Japanese Americans didn't instantly shift from immigrant laborers to settlers in Hawaii after the war. So he showed us how Japanese Americans were integrated with Hawaii's settler society in the territorial period by cooperating with egalitarian Euro-American settlers. And he picked the 2 Japanese real estate development and trust companies, AJIC and ITC. So also the size of the company is different. The both companies successfully acquired lands from Euro-American settlers and catered them to Japanese American clients. AJIC's Hakone and Yamato Tract for JA immigrant elites and Kondo Tract for working class Japanese. And he used many primary documents from land deed records to Hawaii's local newspapers in Japanese and English and individual census records. So questions to his paper. I have 3 questions for each presenters, but well, you don't have to answer to all the questions. So the first, so both ITC and AGIC developed in the 1920s. At the time, the lawsuit over the naturalization of Takao Ozawa was discussed, and the enactment of the 1924 immigration law caused huge anti-US rallies in Japan. So there's a development of ITC and AGIC implies that they try to prove Japanese immigrants' assimilability to American society and willingness for permanent settlement in the US by providing Japanese immigrants with lands and permanent homes in Hawaii. Also, as you mentioned, white landowners cooperated with the Japanese firms because they disagreed with excluding the Japanese. And my second question, so international cooperation or shadows of the Japanese empire. So you argue that the ITC and the AGIC successful acquisition of lands and catering them to Japanese immigrants as homeowners showed Japanese Americans' integration with settler society in Hawaii. So I wonder how much then Japanese political economic leaders in Japan regarded these acquired lands as potential stepstones to expand the Japanese empire and its influence. As you mentioned, Euro-American white settlers in Hawaii might have seen their investment for ITC as an international US-Japan cooperation, but how did the Japanese side see this? For example, the Japanese government regarded the famous Yamato colony built by Kyutaro Abiko in California as a great model for creating foreseeable Japanese colonies in Korea, Manchuria, and Brazil. And in case of the ITC, investors included the head of Sumitomo Zaibatsu. And so do you find any shadows of the Japanese empire over ITC and AGIC? And the last question is about the role of Japanese servants in White House force in acquiring lands by AGIC and ITC. And I found it interesting that you focused on census records to show white settlers and who sold their lands to Japanese real estate companies. They used to employ Japanese servants. So I don't know how ordinarily the Japanese White House force employed the Japanese servants at the time in Hawaii. But do you think the presence of Japanese servants played some role in the eventual transfer of lands from white settlers to AGIC and ITC? So that's it for the Matsumoto's paper. And I'm going to move to the second presentation. Maria compares two Japanese diasporic communities, Davao and Guam, to examine how Japanese locals mobilized their global connections at the outbreak of the US-Japan War. Located on the edge of the US and Japanese empires, Davao and Guam shared identical experience of successive colonization and invasion, first by the US, next by Japan during the World War II, and then back to the US. Even under the pre-war US war, local Japanese communities already existed in Davao and Guam, but they are very different. The Japanese community in Davao had dominant power over local Filipinos in terms of population size and economic influence. On the other hand, the Japanese in Guam were small and had limited economic impact. Interracial marriages between Japanese and local Chamorro were common, but not between Japanese and Filipinos, local Filipinos in Davao. She examines how local Japanese played a different role in the transition from US colonization to Japanese occupation at the outbreaks of war. By analyzing the primary sources, including oral history and photos and films, she argued that Japanese in Guam acted as mediator between the Japanese military and Chamorro, while the Japanese in Davao negotiated with Filipino authority to ask for their protection. So the first question is, so why did the Japanese play a different role in Davao and Guam? And what social, economic, and political conditions made it possible for the Japanese in Davao and Guam to act differently? Even though Japan occupied both US colonized Guam and Davao during World War II, the Japanese takeover happened at different times. The Japanese military conquered Guam only 2 days after the attack, but the Japanese in Davao were interned until the Japanese army came to release them 2 weeks later. So the Japanese in Davao might have had no choice but to negotiate with Filipino authority for the protection right after the attack. On the other hand, the Japanese in Guam acted as a mediator with the Japanese army to protect Chamorro because of their relationship through marriage and kinship. As we pointed out, the Japanese in Guam acted as a mediator by mobilizing their global or Japanese connections, but at the same time, they are also allowed to mobilize their local connections and bonds with Chamorro locals even under the occupation by the Japanese military. So I'm also wondering how successful their mobilization was in the 2 Japanese diasporas. And second question is, in terms of local connections, your paper focuses on the connections between the Japanese diasporic communities and the Japanese military, and between the local Japanese and indigenous people, Filipino and Chamorro. But can we think about the connections and network more horizontally or globally? For example, were there connections between the 2 Japanese communities in Davao and Guam? Or how were the Japanese in Davao and Guam connected with other Japanese diasporic communities, such as the Japanese in Taiwan and Japanese in Saipan, and more, under and beyond the umbrella of Japanese Empire? So if they were not connected, why? And were there any connections between indigenous people, Filipinos and Chamorro? Also, we should not forget about the presence of the US as a colonizer in prior period. How did the US see the growth of Japanese communities under their colonies in the colonization in the Western Pacific? So I know it's too many questions, but I want to emphasize your comparative study provokes many questions about the complexity of Japanese diasporas. And my last question is about the primary sources you use for your analysis. So in Guam's case, you analyze the relationship between local Japanese and Chamorros in wartime by using unpublished oral histories by local Chamorros who experienced the war. On the other hand, in the case of Davao, you rely on wartime reports by the Japanese representatives from the collection published by Davao Kai later. The title of the source, Davao Kai shows, this was created by the Japanese in Davao for the invading Japanese military in order to report and criticize the violence committed by Filipino locals against the Japanese locals after December 8. So the creators of each source were in an opposite position. The case of Guam reflects the local Chamorros and their memories, while the case of Davao reflects the abuse of local Japanese in wartime. So missing are the viewpoints of the Japanese in Guam and Filipinos in Davao. So if you find any limitations of historical sources to compare the 2 communities, so can you share some thoughts with us? Can move on the third presentation, Hoshino's paper. So it's a paper about the network of Osaka Shosen Kabushiki Kaisha, OSK, turned our eyes from lands to oceans. Most immigration scholars have focused on lands, such as how and why people left their countries of origin, and how and why they were included and excluded in host societies. So we tend to miss migrants' experiences on the seas because the voyages to Brazil took 50 to 60 days in the prior period. It's essential to understand the immigrants' experiences on board when we consider mass immigration from Japan to Brazil. Hoshino's paper reminds us that both migrants and cargo for trade should be examined together within the complex system of shipping lines and trade routes. And he argued that Osaka developed as a center of the global network of trade and migration through OSK's involvement in Japanese immigration to Brazil. And in his paper, Osaka has broader meanings. It is a Bay Area encompassing Osaka and Kobe, 2 critical ports of trade, and where Japanese immigrants received training and education before their long trip to Brazil. It also refers to OSK, the shipping company, that carried a large number of Japanese immigrants to Brazil, and finally, it means human networks, connecting outstanding business people like Hirao, Tazaki, and Wata. Well, this is just a suggestion that, so when I read his paper, the term I came out with hanshin. So hanshin is a connecting term the two Osaka and Kobe. So Han is from Osaka and the Shin is from Kobe. So different pronunciations of these Chinese characters. So I don't mean Japan's professional baseball team. This is a major error that Hanshin has meant Osaka Kobe metropolitan industrial region with a railroad connecting the two cities. So I'm not really suggesting him to use Hanshin, but just as an alternative term. So anyway, in studies of Japanese immigration, I think Kobe has occupied unique position because of the Kobe Immigration Center and has really been examined with Osaka. So I found Yuki's approach to Osaka Kobe is quite interesting. And he reveals that how three critical figures, Hirao, Tazaki, and Murata, and their network contributed to OSK's dominance over the transportation of Japanese immigrants to Brazil and the expansion of the trade routes by carefully following their careers. And my questions, first one is, how did the three figures of OSK, Hirao, Tazaki, Murata, perceive the idea of Japanese settler colonialism when they were engaged in Japanese immigration to Brazil? So I'm interested in their philosophy and thought on Japan's imperial expansion. So both Hirao and Tazaki especially were educators, and Tazaki especially devoted himself to the education and training of Japanese immigrants to Brazil. In addition, Japanese immigration to Brazil was resumed in the post-war period. These are philosophy and the ideals for immigration changed or didn't change after the war. The second question, so changing the viewpoint. So how did Brazil, the US, even in the European countries perceive the emergence of OSK in the Pacific and the Atlantic? You mostly rely on Japanese sources, including biographies of Hirao and others, and documents from Japanese Brazilian immigrants. But how did Brazil see businesses with OSK? And did the US and Europe see the expansion of OSK trade routes as a threat to the national security? So if you know some about viewpoints of Brazil and the US, Europe, so could you share them with us? And the last questions is about the connections with the Tokyo University of Commerce. So, Hirao, Tazaki, and Murata all graduated from the Tokyo University of Commerce, currently Hitotsubashi University, and let me abbreviate it as TUC. Even though Tazaki and Murata didn't meet Hirao in college, who is more senior, but is it coincidental that they were educated at TUC? So for example, Hirao's career from working at Tokyo Marine Insurance Company to being an educator at Konam. So all that was designed, Yano Jiro, who's the founder of TUC, contributed to the development to business education in Japan. And he's founded TUC and financially supported Hirao when he was a student. So Yano already left TUC when Tazaki and Murata were TUC students, but we can find the legacy of Yano as Tazaki taught at Kobe Higher Commercial School, the second national business school following TUC. So TUC connections may not be comparable to like the business network at Keio graduates influenced by Yuki Fukuzawa in the US in the 19th century. But how does the development of business education, business schools, including TUC, intersect with Japanese immigration to Brazil? So, so that's all my questions and comments. Thank you for wonderful presentations.
And I guess I'll just address things very briefly, but the first question, is this a response to Japanese exclusion? I think, yes, it's definitely, but it's also a response to the growing kind of internationalism that's occurring at the time, in which Honolulu and Hawaii is seen as the Geneva of the Pacific. And there's some emerging work on this by Courtney Sato and Rumi Yasutake, who address some of these. But I also want to note that even with the internationalist kind of context, that racism and exclusion did exist in Hawaii, certainly. And you know, the work of people like Gary Okihiro has shown that, particularly in the plantation context, but also with World War II internment and Many of the leaders that I spoke about in the Japanese Honolulu business community were interned during World War II, and they are kind of the exception to the idea that internment did not occur on a mass level in Hawaii. For international cooperation, or the shadow of the Japanese Empire, I think I saw actually a lot of connection with what I'm trying to do with my colleague Maria, what she's trying to do as well, and trying to think about these local intimacies and these local kind of contexts, but also thinking about the globalities of these local intimacies. And in that sense, I'm trying to really center Hawaii and its local context, but also see how these local forms of community are also shaped and actually strengthened by global connections between US and Japan. And I think a lot of sociologists have called this like glocalization, that kind of thing. I don't use that word in my paper, but I'm definitely thinking about that. And then regarding the servants, yes, so in a previous version of this paper, I look at the kind of home configurations of many of the business leaders. And what I found was that most of the white Americans who are, investing in these companies, they employ Japanese servants, and certainly for the Japanese corporate leaders as well, they also employ Japanese servants. And I think that although there's no record of kind of what happens in these households, we can kind of get a sense that, if they're letting, Japanese people to labor in their home, there's some sort of liberal attitude, even if they're being exploited for their labor. And we see this in the context, for example, of Japanese American resettlement in World War II. Like a lot of Japanese Americans left the camps so that and entered white American households. And many of the white American households, they kind of saw themselves as being liberal and helping, Japanese Americans out. But the experience of Japanese Americans in those households obviously was not so great. So that's what I have to say. Thanks for your questions. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you so much for the questions and comments. They're very thought-provoking. I'll begin with number 3, sources. So for Guam, it's Chamorro Memories, but actually there's also at least one Japanese memoir, which I couldn't really bring out. And there are Philippine sources for Davao, which again, I didn't bring out, I had to focus. For example, there's historical data papers, the closed reports on war crime trials. Yeah, but the lack of Japanese sources, primary sources, those published during war, the lack of wartime primary sources for Guam is a challenge for me. And that's why I was so excited to go here in Hoover Institution, because one of my very important source for Davao Shimbun, is here. So I was like, ooh, maybe I can get some for Guam. So I'm dealing with that. For the second question, other connections. Actually, when I was, so my presentation is for a book project, and the book project is based on my dissertation, which is really just a comparison of the Japanese question in Davao and Guam. But now that I'm expanding, I'm thinking of, there's this triangle, Japan, going Taiwan, and Philippines, and Marianas. And people move about, especially when I go long durée, pre-war, wartime, and post-war. Right now, I'm just focusing on the war period as an anchor. But for example, I've met people in Guam who do trace their heritage, their family trees to Japan, Okinawa, Philippines, because of post-war movement of Filipinos to Japan, because Japan became under the US, and then after that, they moved to Marianas. So there is this triangle which I would like to explore. Saipan, she mentioned Saipan, that's in the northern Marianas. Maybe not Taiwan, because that's Yiting's presentation tomorrow. But yes, definitely, I'm looking at expanding the scope. Finally, the social realities which affected the differences. Yes, intermarriages is one. Philippine nationalism is another. And the size of Japanese businesses is another. I do have to clarify, though, that intermarriages, you did mention that they were in Davao, there were more intermarriages in Guam, but less intermarriages in Davao. And I'm putting forth Philippine nationalism. There was greater nationalism in the Philippines during this time than among Chamorros during this time. And also Japanese businesses in Davao were larger than those in Guam. So those are social realities that differ, but I am beginning to understand, and I want to emphasize this, nationalism, intermarriages, and businesses, they existed in both areas. The difference is the extent. And I think the extent, the scale of them, the difference in the extent is what makes Davao, the Japanese diaspora in Davao and Japanese diaspora in Guam, polar opposites of what I'm trying to show. Thank you.
Yeah, well, thank you so much for these like really great questions. These are actually some of the questions that I've been also thinking about, and it's really great to hear your thoughts, comments as well. So in terms of the first question, perceptions of, or the philosophy basically of what they were doing, this is, it's kind of an interesting, I come from an interesting sort of angle at this, because most of like the biographies emphasize this as like sort of a philanthropic, like charity work that you are contributing to like this national project by solving this, what some scholars have called like Malthusian expansionism or Malthusian problem of like feeding this growing population. And so like this is like their philosophy, their philosophizing of it is that it's almost like public service. And like that's sort of like been like the dominant narrative. And so I'm actually coming at this to show sort of the more profit side. And so like, yes, like, you know, like they were talking about, you know, like this is a social problem that they're trying to solve, but I think, you know, they were profiting from it like massively. And like these, you know, like celebrity books that talk about like these, their contributions, you know, like they're completely missing this picture that like, yes, like their livelihood, their businesses, like they were really like benefiting from this. Although I do actually wonder about like the wartime, like the last part of your question, which is wartime change. I actually am really curious about that. So maybe that's something I can look into later. So the second question, which is about the foreign government's reactions or relations to OSK, it's very interesting. Now that I started thinking about this, like shipping companies are really at the forefront of foreign diplomacy. They have their own connections to like foreign governments. And their positionality is that they have to have a friendly relation with foreign governments in order to do business. So even when, as in the case of Brazil, like even when Brazil basically like the domestic politics in Brazil turned hostile against Japanese migrants, the OSK and the business people were really greeted favorably by the government. And you know, like the president greeted them. They were really greeted as guests of honor by the Brazilian government. And so I think, and in some cases, they were, I can't remember if it's either OSK or NYK, but in some cases, like in the early 1910s, 1920s, they were receiving subsidy from governments in South America. So throughout this period, I think they actually form a very favorable relationship because it is, and finally, the Tokyo University of Commerce, it's something I've wondered, really. You know, I keep looking into this. OSK was continuously recruiting people from this university actually, and it's sort of like Murata is also known as sort of a like countercultural figure almost by sort of really recruiting like college-educated people in Osaka, which at that time was very hostile to like highly educated people because they thought business education was counterproductive. And so And like even like figures like I believe also Seki Hajime, the mayor of Osaka, was also like educated in Tokyo and had very strong connections to the business education circle. So that's something that I'm really wondering about that I think I really should look into further. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much. So, and we already passed the time. And well, thank you for wonderful presentation. And we can continue the discussion tomorrow. So, well, thank you all of you. And